Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful fall day in New England. Most of the foliage is down, but there are still some remnants of nice color. And I am taking another walk through my neighborhood, enjoying the morning air and the quiet. Hey, everybody, it's Rick, and thanks for joining me on another Inwyt Walkabout. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about making choices, perhaps, and the challenge that I think we all face in the current climate with all the turbulence that's going on politically and in the world as usual, how difficult it is to, what I'll say is, do the right thing. And I want to use an example, a story again of my mom, who, as I kind of reflect on her life, really did face a number of challenges that I think many of us have not. And just share with you an experience that kind of puts that whole issue, I think, in very nice context. So, as I mentioned in a prior episode, my mom is German. She experienced World War II as a young adolescent child, and ultimately married my dad, who was Dutch and had a similar experience on the other side of the line, if you will, of the war. And they ultimately came together as enemies, if you will, perceived as such, and got married and had their own challenges as a result of that union. And as part of their journey together, they actually met in the United States as fellows, as clinical fellows in pediatrics, and ultimately decided that they wanted to stay in the United States rather than go back to Europe. And in order to move that forward, they had to leave the country for a couple of years and spent that time in Canada, waiting for their eligibility to show up so that they could reapply for green card, different visa status. And they got their green cards, came back to the United States. I had been born in the meantime, and the time came where my mother was now eligible for getting U.S. citizenship. And so she went to the federal office for immigration to sign the paperwork and essentially be sworn in as a U.S. citizen. And I think, to her surprise, as part of the document, there was a section that she was required to check off or to sign, saying that she would bear arms to defend the United States against its enemies. And based on her, her experience, and I think just her worldview, she just refused. She said, "I will not sign this. I cannot sign this." And the immigration officers, really, I think, were taken aback, because I don't think that they had probably ever experienced that, or very rarely, didn't know what to do, and said, "Well, if you don't sign this, then we can't make you a U.S. citizen." And she basically just said, I cannot sign this. And long story short is, they, I think, ultimately, in the absence of a clear direction, or maybe they had, I don't know, some insight of their own, ultimately allowed her to become a U.S. citizen. And and then she moved on with the next phases of her life. So what's the point of the story? I think there are a number of things that can be pointed out, but fundamentally, I think that one of the powerful stances and messages that, for me, come out of that story is essentially having clarity, an understanding of what correct action is. And through the experience of seeing the human suffering in war, and sort of the misperceptions and the impressions and ideas that basically always show up as cause of war, conflict, she saw through that and said, this is not something I support. It's not the right thing to do. And she just stood her ground. And, you know, she obviously had a huge amount of her life at stake in taking that position. And, you know, I think from her perspective, when I talked to her about it, it wasn't even a consideration as to what the potential impact would be on her trajectory. You know, it was either I become a citizen without signing this, or I will not be a citizen, and then I'll figure out what to do next. But it is not negotiable to not do what's correct. And, you know, again, you kind of look at those positions in the context of, you know, what's going on in society now and probably throughout, where there is always some pressure or influence to do something, whether it's politically, whether it's at work, whether it's within your family. There are always these pressures to do things because, you know, somebody wants you to, and or because we're being very self-centered about, you know, what's in it for us. You know, there's the upside and the downside, and I'll take the upside, regardless of whether it's the right thing to do or not. And we end up getting into situations where, as more and more people acquiesce and become, you know, essentially subservient to, you know, other people's wishes, regardless of whether it's correct or not, lead us in a direction where we can get ourselves into big trouble, not only individually, but, you know, as towns, countries, the planet. And all of a sudden we're in a situation where we go, how did we get here? And, you know, what is going on? And, you know, many times we've hit a point where there is, again, significant conflict or war, or, you know, things break out that one really didn't have to get to, but where we let ourselves be led. So, you know, again, I think there are, to me, two messages from, you know, my mom's story, from that story. One is, again, just having clarity and understanding about what is correct and holding the line on that, and basically saying that is not negotiable. I will do what's correct and face the consequence, whatever that is. And I think perhaps, you know, as powerful and as important is the observation that when you do take a stand for what's correct in a way that, again, you know, maybe it's not confrontational, but it is a position that challenges the norm, you can have very powerful impact on, you know, a larger paradigm just by taking an individual stance for that. And so when we're, you know, struggling, you know, I think my kids, a lot of people in general, are always looking for ways to engage in sort of the bigger challenges that we face in society or at work, or, you know, anywhere where there's larger areas of conflict and problems. We always feel somewhat helpless in our ability to engage, and we always kind of feel like we have to get into some big group or some big protest to just, you know, make ourselves heard, and not necessarily know what kind of action is going to come from that. And again, I'll just come back to the observation and the recognition that you can do all that. There's nothing wrong with that, but it really starts with you, with us individually, to hold the line and say, if you do what's correct for yourself, not because it's the right thing for you, but you toe the line for what's correct and hold that position, and just, you know, deal with the consequences of that, or what happens, and you're always in that space. You have very powerful influence and impact on people around you, and, you know, many people are afraid to act and to step up because everybody else seems to be acquiescing as well. So just keep that in mind as you know, you go through your daily lives, your daily activities. We're always confronted with, you know, what's best for me versus what's the correct thing to do. And we see that all the time in problem solving. So that's it for today. You know, I hope you have a great rest of the day today, and maybe a little bit of time to reflect on that. And, you know, I'll leave you with another quick view of just the surrounding fall here in New England. Again, not a whole lot of foliage left. Thanks for joining me. I'm Rick. This is Inwyt Walkabout, and take care.